hope you had a great break and are recovering from grading, if that's been holding you up for the last few days, and gearing up for a good year. So for the first coffee morning of 2022, we're very pleased to welcome Karen Keaveney. So Karen's a geographer and spatial planner in the Agribusiness and Rural Development section of the School of Agriculture and Food Science, and she's going to be talking broadly about grappling with rural change from within. So I really look forward to hearing what you've got to say, Karen, and thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. And I was just saying, sort of as we were starting, I'm just going to give an overview of where I'm coming from and some of the projects I'm doing. So I'm happy to kind of go into more detail, but I try to keep it simple. So can everyone see and hear me? Okay, that's always the check with Zoom. Okay. Yeah. So what I'm going to do today is just talk a little bit about me to give you some background, and then I'm going to speak about my philosophical approach to the rural and kind of what really drives my research and my interest, and you'll get a little bit of that even from my own background. And then finally, I'm going to just outline some of the projects I've either recently completed or we're currently doing that really are adapting place-based approaches or place-based responses to change and challenges for rural areas. So a little bit about me first. I know Katrina Devery is a big fan of Big Tom, so I always have to have a photograph of him there. But I think even prior to my studies, I grew up between places. I grew up between Boyle in North County Roscommon and a place called Glenamaddy in County Galway. And the reason I bring that up, because I think geographers are obviously very attached to place, but I think it's only with hindsight I realise how much that living between places really shaped and continues to shape my approach to my research and really what interests me. And really, I lived between places because on one hand, we had a family farm in one place in Galway, and then my parents worked off farm elsewhere in Roscommon. And so while that wasn't an unusual story, and it still isn't an unusual story for a lot of people living in rural Ireland, where they're trying to maintain maybe traditions that have been going on for some time while still trying to live their everyday lives and working in traditional or non-traditional employment. And so Big Tom is there. He had a very famous song called Four Roads to Glenamaddy, and that really kind of epitomizes for me some of the kind of romanticization we do about rural places. And then if you want any insight into my childhood growing up in the late 80s, early 90s in Roscommon, Moonboy kind of captures that for me, because that's very much based around that time and about the place I grew up in. So following all that moving around, I did my degree in geography in NUI Galway, and that was a very foundational experience, because rural geography was and continues to be a really central part of what they do there. And Mary Cawley in particular, a professor there, was massively influential in setting up my foundations for rural geography. Then went on to do the Masters of Regional and Urban Planning in UCD in Lichfield, and then went on to do my PhD in Maynooth University, where I looked at one-off housing in the Irish countryside. That was in the early 2000s. Then went on, while I was still finishing my PhD, I lectured in rural spatial planning in Queen's University, Belfast. And during that time, where my focus was very strongly on planning and housing, I was very fortunate to be a regular visitor to the Joint Centre for Housing at Harvard, where I was doing a lot of comparison between Massachusetts, rural urban fringe, and Ireland. And then I also took some time as a visiting professor at the University of Toronto before arriving in UCD, which I just realized this morning is nearly 8 years ago that I started in UCD. It feels like yesterday. So some of that really does, and that kind of, as I said at the beginning, the between places does really drive my interest in my research in the rural. It really drives my kind of passion about kind of moving away from simplistic approaches to the rural. So moving away from binaries. from the sort of urban-rural divide, or looking at places very simplistically as core or periphery. And I really find what Castry talks about here as very central to my work, which is really that two of the main limitations of core periphery models are that they obscure a more complex, uneven development, and they fetishize spatial relations at the cost or at the expense of social relations. So really, as a geographer, I'm really passionate about understanding places from within and trying to recognize and acknowledge the diversity of places, but still developing policy responses to support those places. And it's really challenging. Haven't figured it all out yet, but still trying to understand those places. Philosophically, I would say that the work of Henri Lefebvre is incredibly influential in my work, particularly in his work around production of space. And he very much focuses on the everyday. So in a quote here, he talks about the establishment of the everyday, but really how we need to look deep within that. And Halfacree, in a very seminal piece in 2006, adapted Lefebvre's approach to rural and developed a threefold model of rural space, which looks at rural localities. So that's where we acknowledge that rural places are distinct spatial practices that define rural places. There's formal representations of places that we need to uncover, and that also we need to recognize the everyday lives of people and how they live in places. So from that, from kind of my own background of understanding part-time farming and understanding why we were moving away from what might be considered traditional kind of rural practices to the philosophical approaches of really trying to understand rural localities and how we represent places, I really, I suppose, adapt a place-based response to change and challenges in rural areas. And I'll go through my projects in a minute. For those who may not be familiar, but I think place-based approaches have really come to the fore in more recent years, and I think more and more people are becoming familiar with them. They really are trying to address policy approaches that support communities to address their challenges and opportunities within their own territories. So place-based approaches really have three key objectives: to really look holistically at sustainable development. So not just address economic challenges, but also encompass social and environmental challenges. And we can see that obviously in sustainable really being adapted into policy, and particularly rural development policy. It's also acknowledging that there are different types of rural, so that we move away from simple rural dichotomies, that binary I spoke about a minute ago, to actually view the rural as continuous views of territory, where actually rural is everywhere and it is different. And then that we acknowledge that there's different types of stakeholders within rural places, so from not just government, but also the private sector and civil society. That's really about co-designing policy and engaging with people. So in terms of that context, I have a series of projects running under kind of the rural development theme within the School of Agriculture, and building a team of researchers there, working with research assistants and postdocs, where primarily kind of my key, I suppose my flagship project at the moment is an IRC funded project under the Coalesce scheme. And that's called Citizen Rural, which is called, and it's looking at digital data for participatory democracy in remote places. And my co-PI in that project is Ainhoa Gonzalez, who a fellow Earth Institute member and based in the School of Geography. And in that project, we're looking at how can robust data-driven social, economic, and environmental evidence bases be established for rural geographies. and particularly for rural areas that don't have the kind of same data infrastructure as urban places. And then, and part of that is also looking at how we can engage rural citizens with that data to co-design strategies for the sustainable development of their localities. The project really is only beginning to start now. With my planning hat on since last year, I've been collaborating on 2 projects, one being the In Place project, which we're doing with Maynooth University and University of Ulster. And that's looking at planning, placemaking, and changing spatial relationships between home and workplace. And what we're doing in that, we're in phase 1 of that at the moment, and we're looking at 3 case studies, one in Clare, Wicklow, and in County Down. And we're looking at pre and post-COVID relationships with commuting and how commuting is changing, and potentially how remote working or changing work practices may impact on places, particularly small rural towns. And then also with a former Earth Institute member working with Bruno De Andre, looking at its Geo West Coast, that's looking at community planning on the West Coast. Watch the time here. Also as part of my work, while it wouldn't be mainly agricultural, what I am interested in is how communities engage with agricultural change. And I've completed an evaluation and currently doing work on Farming for Nature projects, but how communities are engaging with those beyond the farm gate. And then finally, I have interest in education, where I'm currently working with Monaghan Leader, where there's training for smart villages, and also previously have worked with my colleague Sinead Flannery on agricultural education and understanding needs and motivations of students in changing rural contexts when agriculture is changing so much. So that's it really. I know that was a bit of a whirlwind.
Karen, yeah, no, that was really great. You covered a super kind of spread, fantastic set of projects and some really interesting scene-setting philosophies. And I enjoyed your sense of having grown up between places as a way of changing the way that you see the world. I think that's really interesting. And does anyone have any comments or questions that they'd like to raise? If not, the question one of the things that I was kind of curious about, so you'd emphasized the kind of value of a place-based approach that was coming in. I was curious what had been there before, what approach had been previously taken.
Well, funnily enough, like place-based approaches have actually been very common. Place-based approaches have really been, I suppose, officially in existence for 30 years plus through the LEADER program. And the LEADER program, for maybe those who aren't familiar with it, is the European Rural Development Program, very much looking at more the community. It comes under Pillar 2 of the CAP, but tends to look more community engagement and need and socioeconomic need. It wouldn't just be tied to farming. And that would have always had a place-based philosophy. And in many ways, the informal or semi-formal processes that led to LEADER had that, because in many ways for rural places, you know, there was an element of nobody else is going to help us, so it has to come from within. We may not have used the language of place-based maybe prior to the mid to early 90s, but that was actually always a strong element. It's just interesting. I think what I'm noticing is that language around place-based is being used more broadly now. Whereas I felt previously, and open to disagreement on it, was that it was always strong in LEADER. If you go back to all the documentation around European approaches are very much is territorial, it is place-based. But now we're beginning to see it in the Just Transition movement. And I'm just seeing that language out there a lot more. And in many ways, for me, it's another iteration of rural development, just by it with another title. But that's a good thing, you know, for me.
And is the place-based approach sort of taking much greater concern about the specifics of the individual places and the people in them, rather than a more of a broad brush blanket view of how things should be done and incentivized?
Yeah, because I think when we looked at local responses to change, it was always that place-based, obviously, I suppose. But the national top-down approach, I didn't recognize diversity. They began to recognize it in maybe like, you know, if you go back to the National Spatial Strategy in the early 2000s, there was a lot of work done on rural typologies then, where there was a recognition of difference, but there wasn't a policy adjustment. And definitely last year, our Rural Future, the new rural development strategy, was produced, and that definitely, and even its predecessor, the rural strategy, is beginning to officially recognize difference. But I think there's still a massive challenge in how, I mean, that actually makes it harder. But I do think with like the sustainable development goals and everything being brought in, I think it's bringing all those things to the fore, and there's definitely more effort to try to have place-based policy responses. And also, you know, understanding that it is communities, local government that actually is best placed to actually engage with and implement those responses as well.
Absolutely. Mihal has a question there. Mihal?
Yeah, I'm muted. Well, Karen, thank you very much for the presentation. You've got an interesting background and suite of projects. Just following on the change theme, I was just wondering, do you see an increase in the pace of change in the dynamics? And do you see new drivers coming in? And I suppose following on from that, the feedbacks there, is that change affecting the rural areas themselves, like say the landscape and the people and the dynamics between their responses to these policies? I know there's a lot of change coming down the road in terms of climate change and food preference changes, but can you see that appearing in the data that you're getting?
Yeah, so you asked me a big question there. Like change, I suppose rate of change probably is increasing, but in many ways, rural places, and obviously I'm very focused on Ireland at the moment anyway in my work. And in many ways, the change is being built from particularly the 1960s, when we became it's only then we became like an urban industrial society. And so the change initially is focused on agriculture, because agriculture was the mainstay of rural areas. Obviously, it's still the largest land user, but the reality is the majority of people don't work in farming, don't have any relationship with farming food production. And so that change is kind of like this big global change that's happened for Western countries to a large extent, where rural populations have become more diverse, aren't relying on traditional factors, and that's kind of brought us up. And in one sense, in Ireland, I think we're still struggling with that change, like getting our heads around it. Because then you're completely right, the next change then, or I mean, not that it's that kind of, linear, but then I think that's possibly why rural places are struggling with this idea around climate change and changes in food production, because we almost haven't come to grips with how we've changed already. Because still, when it comes from a policy perspective, the farm lobby is incredibly strong in Ireland still, and it's incredibly influential in rural policy, even though the farm lobby doesn't actually represent the majority of rural people. So we haven't, I think until we come to terms with actually who the rural is or are, whatever the correct grammatical phrase is there, we're going to struggle with actually bringing in changes be it the changes that are brought by climate change, and then also the responses required to address climate change. So I think there's going to be this is why this, in the media, whenever there's with the climate change bill, all this kind of like it's anti-rural, but I mean, that's just so self-defeating to have that. We need to actually get much more kind of deeper into what that means. Like from the data I have, be it, you know, census data, and then actually working with communities, when you actually work with people, like say the Farming for Nature projects, farmers are in one sense one of the best. They understand nature and climate, and they actually are incredibly open. But one of the problems is the incentives to farm for nature are incredibly weak in this country. And that is one of the challenges. And they're just trying to keep the lights on. They're just trying to live their lives, keep their families going. And yet they're actually disincentivized often to away, you know, they're incentivized towards production agriculture. And really, again, we've kind of not fully acknowledged that farming has changed and rural areas have changed. And I think it's all really interlinked.
Thank you. That's more food for thought.
I know.
Can I just ask a follow-on, if you don't mind, Taz?
Yeah,
yeah, that just brought to mind, is there a new rural now? I mean, you see people moving into the rural areas and rewilding land and changing totally from production to nature conservation. Is that significant, or is that just a tip, a very small tip of what's happening?
It seems to be growing. Like, for example, the Corn Creek Life project that I'm involved with, evaluating the socioeconomic side of it, that's only early days. That only started up last year, and that's a 5-year project. There's definitely, you know, I was going to use the word alternative, and I shouldn't, you know, like, but there is definitely a change in movement towards it, but it's minimal numbers. And again, it's kind of going back to the policies, and the subsidies for farming are so geared towards production agriculture that there is a minority, but I would say a growing minority of farmers that want to do things differently. And then even you can see, even my own colleagues in the research they're doing, it is much more looking at biodiversity and things like that. But I think we still have a long way to go for it to actually become mainstream into rural communities and for farmers. But there's definitely a movement back, and obviously there's been a movement, and it's the big kind of flagship of the Our Rural Future policy is remote working. So that would be possibly people who are farming but not, you know, either the people moving back. But you know, that's probably more to do with house prices, to be honest, than, you know, like, I wonder if people could live close to where they work and afford it, they'd probably happily do that. So I think that we're almost romanticizing the remote working and return, you know, the move back to rural, but actually it's more to do with structural dysfunctionality of cost of living and housing in Ireland.
Thank you.
There's a question in the chat there from Magdara, saying, following on from Mihil's question. You mentioned the rural imaginary and Big Tom earlier. Could you perhaps comment further on this concept of the rural imaginary and how this may interact with climate adaptation and so on? And actually, I had a similar kind of, because I was struck by that kind of three-way split that you had between understanding the locality, understanding the people in it, and understanding the cultural representations. And I've had some really interesting and worthwhile collaborations with the people in the School of English Drama and Film around those kind of cultural representations and the interaction between sort of the cultural representations and the people that they're representing, and the way they kind of feed each other and develop sort of together. And I wondered if you engaged also with people with that kind of perspective, that cultural representation and the imaginary that flows from that.
Yeah, I hadn't. It's actually, yeah, it's it's a really good question, because I hadn't thought of it as specifically as that. I think I always thought about, and I do think about the imaginary as, you know, like I always hold up the imaginary as something that kind of it conceals the reality and it conceals the complexity. But then in one sense, what you and Magdara are saying there actually really takes that forward to looking at actually, you know, how could that interact with climate adaptation? And, you know, in one sense, like, you know, and maybe it's a more recent thing, I'm just thinking of some of the work I have done with farmers and that idea of what a good farmer is versus a bad farmer. And a good farmer is the productive farmer. and there's an imaginary around that as well. But is that, and depending on, I'm thinking of the stuff I did down in Kerry in the Ivory Peninsula, where, it was all like the working almost against the land to be a productive farmer. But there's a whole complexity of imaginary in that as well. But I actually hadn't really thought about, that's almost like an obvious next step that I wish I had thought about. And now I'm going to think about it. So I don't have an answer.
And that kind of relates. There was another question that related to me privately, asking about whether there are, as you said, the perception and the imagination about what's going on in the rural environment doesn't necessarily match very well what really is going on in the rural environment. I think is what you're sort of saying, and people tend to have a very negative perception of it as a place that's really struggling, and towns dying, no jobs, and so on. I mean, do you see more positive signs for the future? Is there a better story there, really?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I do basically. I feel that this decline narrative and this kind of, driven by politicians, often, it's unhelpful, because actually, even if you want, and I hate looking too short term, but like towns have actually benefited from COVID in one sense. I'm not saying obviously there's like but actually what we have found in work is the vibrancy of towns has actually changed. And while a lot of people are worried about Dublin city centre, the actual knock-on effect has been suburbs and towns where at daytime economies have actually been revived because people are more based in their locality. So that's been one benefit, but we need to learn from that and see, okay, well, how can that be maybe fostered? Because we can't assume that's going to just happen all the time. So I would see it as, I always say, it's very complex and diverse, but I don't see rural areas as dying, to be honest. I mean, I see them as incredibly vibrant places. And I mean, it's easy to drive through a town and think it looks a bit quiet, but actually there's a lot going on behind the scenes that people don't always realize. So there's a lot of vibrant, and that's why kind of looking at how they're represented and then working with communities to really understand what is actually happening. And I mean, that's the philosophy of rural development. It's saying, well, what is here? What are we good at? What can we do? What can we build upon that? How can we build upon that to develop it further? So I don't see it as a negative always. And I think that this kind of decline thing and the whole, poor rural areas are being left behind, which I mean, obviously some are, and but I think that actually comes from a kind of neoliberal approach where we're competing against each other. Places, kind of the way now we've been set up from a funding point of view, is places are competing against each other. So they kind of have to, because they have to give a rationale for why we need the funding. So we still need the funding and the support to continue, but actually there's a great diversity and willingness for growth and change in places.
That's great. That's actually a good point to end us on, and actually, because we're out of time now, but actually that also kind of picks up on Thomas's point in the chat there about the imaginary as a further indication of the complexity of rural life. There's so much more going on behind the scenes than we imagine from afar. So I think that's really good to think in those terms. So unless anyone else has any other last comments, Ray?
Yeah, could I come in, Tasman? Yeah, thanks very much, Karen, for a very interesting talk. I'm from a rural background myself, and I've had some interaction with farmers in recent times, and I get a sense there's a great feeling of demoralization. That even on viable farms, the children don't want to go into farming. And that's maybe partly economical, but there's also a demoralization aspect to the whole thing. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, in others, some of the work I do on agricultural education, that has come up when we've looked at motivations for students to do the green cert, which kind of allows them to get grants and things for farming. But yeah, there is what we have found, and my colleague Tomas Russell has worked on this also. What we have found is in those non-viable farms or yeah, it is a struggle. And to be honest, for many it is economic, because you can't raise a family on those farms. You know, people can't see their lives going, you know, continuing. So, and this has been going on for a long time. I mean, that's how I grew up on a part-time farm, and that was, you know, the 80s. So like that is definitely there, and we're seeing that in some of our agricultural education research. On the other side, in larger farms, particularly dairy, there is motivation to work, but there's a different approach to those farms. They're full-time, they are run much more business-like. So there is a it depends. It tends to be the more dry stock beef farms, part-time, and all on the west coast that you'll find demotivation. And then it tends to be the sort of larger farms, which actually just makes sense, because if it's a viable business and people see that they can make a way of life, then it's a job. Because I know myself, you know, I teach on the ag science programs. We have, you know, 300 plus students every year coming into our programs. Not all of them by any means are from a farming background or will go into farming, but a significant number of those students have an absolute passion for farming and want to continue farming, be it in part-time or full-time mode. So again, there's a difference there, I would say, in the farm enterprise, and how young people are motivated to keep farming.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Karen, and thanks everyone for your involvement. That's really fascinating discussion, I think, and one we can obviously hopefully continue. And if anyone wants to link up with Karen for collaborative ideas and so on, please do. That's really the lifeblood of the Earth Institute. So thanks again, Karen, and thanks everyone for getting involved. And I hope to see you next week at the Coffee Morning.
And thanks to the Earth Institute for all its support. It's been fantastic.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye, Karen.